Elena Rodriguez had been waiting tables at Murphy's Diner for 3 years, and she thought she'd seen everything until the morning she watched a man in an expensive suit quietly falling apart in booth 7. His hands shook as he stared at his untouched coffee, sweat beading on his forehead despite the restaurant's cool air conditioning. What she didn't know was that this trembling stranger would soon offer her a life she'd never imagined, a 6-figure salary, and a chance to change the world. But first, she had to save him from drowning in his own mind. The question was, could one act of kindness from a small-town waitress reach across the vast divide between her world and his? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The lunch rush at Murphy's Diner was in full swing when Elena Rodriguez first noticed the man in booth 7 wasn't eating. She'd served him black coffee 20 minutes ago, watching as he'd mumbled his order without making eye contact, his expensive charcoal suit standing out like a peacock among the construction workers and local farmers who usually filled the red vinyl seats. Now, balancing 3 plates of the daily special on her left arm while pouring coffee refills with her right hand, she caught sight of him again. Something was wrong. The man's breathing had become shallow and rapid, his chest rising and falling in quick, desperate movements that reminded Elena of a trapped bird. His hands gripped the edge of the scratched formica table so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and a thin sheen of perspiration covered his pale face, despite the diner's aggressive air conditioning that usually left customers reaching for their jackets. Elena had seen panic before, in her younger brother Miguel when he'd had his first anxiety attack during finals week, in her grandmother Rosa during those final hospital visits when the machines seemed to multiply around her bed like mechanical vultures. "Table 12 needs extra napkins," called out Ruby, the other waitress working the lunch shift, her voice cutting through Elena's growing concern. Ruby had been working at Murphy's since before Elena was born, her teased hair and heavy makeup armor against the daily grind of demanding customers and meager tips. She moved through the dining room with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to see people as orders, rather than individuals, but Elena had never been able to develop that particular survival skill. Elena quickly delivered the plates to table 4, a group of electricians who barely looked up from their phones to acknowledge her presence, then made her way back toward booth 7. The man's condition had deteriorated in the few minutes she'd been away. His breathing had become even more labored, and she could see him fighting against invisible chains that seemed to be tightening around his chest. His dark hair, perfectly styled when he'd first walked in, now showed damp patches where sweat had begun to collect, and his usual olive complexion had taken on an alarming grayish pallor. "Sir?" Elena's voice was soft, barely audible over the clatter of dishes and conversation that filled the diner's cramped space. "Are you feeling all right?" The man's eyes snapped up to meet hers, and Elena was struck by their intensity. They were a deep brown, almost black, but filled with such raw terror that she instinctively took a step closer rather than away. She'd expected to see the glazed look of someone having a medical emergency, but instead found herself looking into the eyes of someone who was drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people but utterly alone in his struggle. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. "I can't breathe." Elena glanced around the busy diner, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read a room's mood in seconds. Murphy himself was behind the grill, his substantial belly pressed against the metal counter as he flipped burgers and called out orders in his gravelly voice. The lunch crowd was thick and impatient, the kind of hungry working people who needed to eat fast and get back to their jobs. Ruby was handling 6 tables and looking increasingly frazzled, her usual efficiency beginning to crack under the pressure of the busy afternoon. Nobody else had noticed the crisis unfolding in booth 7, and Eleanor realized with crystal clarity that this man's well-being was entirely in her hands. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar coat, the same feeling she'd carried throughout her childhood when Miguel would wake up screaming from nightmares about their father leaving, or when her mother would work double shifts and trust Elena to keep the family together with nothing more than her determination and a $20 bill for groceries. "You're having a panic attack," Elena said quietly, sliding into the booth across from him without asking permission. The vinyl squeaked under her weight, a sound that usually annoyed her, but now seemed oddly comforting in its familiarity. It feels like you're dying, but you're not. You're safe." The man stared at her with a mixture of surprise and desperate hope, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone had not only noticed his distress, but was willing to sit with him through it. Elena had abandoned her other tables, left Ruby to handle the increasingly impatient customers who would undoubtedly complain about slow service, risked Murphy's notorious temper by deviating from the rigid P's. Efficiency, he demanded from his staff. But something about this stranger's raw vulnerability had activated every protective instinct she possessed. "What's your name?" she asked, keeping her voice steady and calm despite the chaos surrounding them. A group of teenagers had just walked in, their voices loud and demanding as they complained about the wait for a table. The coffee machine was hissing and gurgling, adding to the symphony of everyday noise that seemed to press in on them from all sides. "Evan," he managed to say, the single word requiring obvious effort. Evan Pierce. The name meant nothing to Elena, who had grown up in a household where technology consisted of an ancient television that required percussive maintenance and a cell phone that her mother had bought secondhand from a coworker. She'd never been particularly interested in the business world or celebrity gossip, preferring to focus on the immediate and tangible challenges of her own life. Working 2 jobs while taking night classes at the community college left little time for following the exploits of the wealthy and famous. "Okay, Evan, I'm Elena." She reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his, feeling the tremors that ran through his fingers like electrical current. His skin was cold and clammy, but she didn't pull away. Physical contact had always been her instinctive response to someone else's pain, a trait that had sometimes gotten her into trouble, but more often had proven to be exactly what someone needed. "I want you to focus on my voice. Okay? Just my voice. Everything else is just noise." Elena began to guide him through the breathing exercises she'd learned during those long nights with Miguel, techniques she'd picked up from free mental health resources at the community center when professional help had been too expensive for their family's stretched budget. She counted his breaths, her voice steady and reassuring, as she helped him slow down the frantic rhythm that was feeding his panic. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. Simple words for a complex process, but Elena had learned that sometimes the simplest approach was the most effective. "That's good," she murmured, as his breathing began to stabilize slightly. "You're doing great. The feeling will pass, I promise. It always passes." Around them, the diner continued its relentless pace. Elena could feel Ruby's disapproving glances burning into her back, could hear Murphy's voice getting increasingly agitated as orders backed up and customers grew restless. Her section was falling apart, her tips for the day were probably shot, and she'd likely face a lecture from Murphy about priorities and professionalism. But Evan's grip on her hand had loosened slightly, and some color was beginning to return to his face. "Can you tell me 5 things you can see?" Elena asked, a grounding technique she'd learned from a free anxiety workshop at the library. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his features, making his exhaustion more pronounced, but his eyes were beginning to focus more clearly on his surroundings. The salt shaker," Evan said slowly, his voice gaining strength. "Your name tag, the crack in the window behind you, that man's red shirt, the coffee stain on the table. Perfect, now 4 things you can touch." Elena watched as he methodically worked through the exercise, his panic gradually receding like a tide pulling back from the shore. His breathing returned to normal, his grip on the table relaxed, and the terrible pallor began to fade from his skin. She'd seen this transformation before, had guided Miguel through it dozens of times, but it never stopped feeling like a small miracle when someone found their way back from the edge of that particular abyss. "Better?" she asked after several minutes had passed. Evan nodded, running a shaky hand through his dark hair. "Much better. Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "No one's ever just sat with me like that before." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Elena didn't fully understand. She'd grown up in a world where crisis brought people together, where neighbors showed up with casseroles when someone lost a job, where family meant dropping everything to help even when you had nothing to spare. The idea that someone could face their darkest moments alone seemed impossibly sad to her. "Rodriguez!" Murphy's voice boomed across the diner, sharp with irritation. "Table 9 is still waiting for their check, and 12 wants to know where their pie went." Elena sighed, the spell of the moment broken by the harsh reality of her responsibilities. She'd neglected her other customers for nearly 30 minutes, a luxury she couldn't afford in a job where every tip mattered, where the difference between paying rent and falling short often came down to whether she could charm an extra dollar or two from each table. "I have to get back to work," she said apologetically, starting to slide out of the booth. "Will you be okay?" Evan reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet that looked like it cost more than Elena made in a month. The leather was soft and expensive, the kind of quality that spoke of a world far removed from the discount stores and thrift shops that comprised Elena's shopping experience. He pulled out a $100 bill and placed it on the table, the crisp currency looking almost foreign among the everyday wear and tear of the diner's surfaces. "For the coffee," he said quietly. "And for—" he gestured vaguely, encompassing the previous half hour of Elena's undivided attention, her willingness to abandon her other responsibilities to help a complete stranger through his crisis. Elena stared at the money, her mind struggling to process the amount. $100 was groceries for 2 weeks. A month of bus fare? The difference between having her electricity shut off or keeping the lights on. She'd never received a tip larger than $20, and that had been from a drunk businessman who'd probably forgotten the amount by the next morning. "I can't take this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The money represented security, breathing room, the ability to sleep at night without calculating and recalculating how to stretch her paycheck to cover all the necessities. "Please," Evan said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up at him again. "You have no idea what you just did for me. This doesn't even begin to cover it." He stood up, straightening his expensive suit, and Elena noticed for the first time how tall he was, how his presence seemed to command attention even in his disheveled state. There was an authority about him that went beyond clothing or grooming, something that suggested he was accustomed to having his words carry weight, his decisions respected without question. "Thank you, Elena," he said, and the way he spoke her name suggested he was committing it to memory. "Really, thank you." He walked out of Murphy's diner without looking back, leaving Elena sitting in the booth with a $100 bill and a dozen questions she couldn't answer. She watched through the cracked window as he climbed into a black sedan that had been waiting at the curb, the kind of car with tinted windows and diplomatic plates that suggested wealth and privacy in equal measure. "Earth to Rodriguez." Ruby's voice cut through Elena's confusion. "You gonna sit there all day, or are you gonna help me with this rush?" Elena pocketed the money and threw herself back into the lunch service, but her mind kept returning to the stranger in booth 7. There had been something about Evan Pierce that didn't quite fit, a quality that suggested his panic attack had been about more than just everyday stress or overwork. The way he'd avoided eye contact when he'd first arrived, the expensive car waiting outside, the casual way he'd handed over $100 as if it were pocket change, all of it pointed to a story much more complex than she'd initially imagined. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of orders and complaints, spilled coffee and burned toast, the usual chaos that defined life at Murphy's diner. But Elena found herself glancing toward booth 7 throughout the afternoon, half expecting to see Evan Pierce sitting there again, his dark eyes filled with that terrible vulnerability she'd witnessed. The booth remained empty, but the memory of their encounter lingered like smoke in still air. When her shift finally ended at 4 o'clock, Elena walked home through the tree-lined streets of her neighborhood, past the small houses with their chain-link fences and carefully tended gardens that represented the modest dreams of working-class families. The $100 bill felt heavy in her pocket, a tangible reminder of the morning's strange encounter. She'd helped people before, had always been the one friends and family turned to in crisis, but she'd never been compensated for her instinctive compassion. That evening, as she sat at her small kitchen table working on homework for her business administration class, Elena found herself wondering about Evan Pierce. The name had seemed familiar when she'd repeated it to herself on the walk home, but she couldn't place where she might have heard it. She opened her laptop, a second-hand machine that took 5 minutes to boot up and occasionally made concerning whirring sounds, and typed his name into the search engine. The results that populated her screen made her breath catch in her throat. Evan Pierce wasn't just wealthy. He was famous, the 34-year-old founder and CEO of Pierce Technologies, a company whose software had revolutionized social media integration and made him one of the youngest billionaires in the world. His photograph stared back at her from dozens of articles and interviews. The same dark eyes and serious expression she'd seen across the diner table, but cleaned up and professionally lit, surrounded by the trappings of success and achievement. Elena scrolled through article after article, her amazement growing with each new revelation. Pierce Technologies employed over 15,000 people worldwide. Evan had been featured on the cover of major business magazines, had given keynote speeches at technology conferences, had been photographed with presidents and prime ministers. His net worth was estimated in the billions, his influence extending far beyond the technology sector into philanthropy and social causes. But the more Eleanor read, the more she began to understand the source of his panic attack. The articles painted a picture of someone living under intense scrutiny, whose every decision was analyzed and criticized by industry experts and financial reporters. There were mentions of hostile takeover attempts, of personal relationships scrutinized by gossip columnists, of the crushing pressure that came with being responsible for thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in investor money. One article from 6 months earlier caught her attention particularly. It detailed Evan's increasing reclusiveness, his tendency to cancel public appearances at the last minute, his apparent struggle with what the writer delicately termed the pressures of public life. There were quotes from unnamed sources suggesting that the young billionaire was struggling with anxiety and depression, that the weight of his responsibilities and the constant media attention were taking a toll on his mental health. Elena closed the laptop and sat back in her chair, her mind reeling from the implications of what she'd learned. The trembling man in booth 7 hadn't been just another stressed businessman having a bad day. He'd been one of the most powerful people in the technology industry, a man whose decisions affected millions of users and thousands of employees, experiencing a very public and very private breakdown in the unlikely setting of Murphy's Diner. The next 2 days passed normally, filled with the usual routines of work and school that defined Elena's life. She served coffee and scrambled eggs to construction workers and retirees, took orders for Murphy's famous apple pie and meatloaf, collected tips that rarely exceeded 10% and often fell short of 5. But she found herself glancing toward booth 7 more often than usual, wondering if Evan Pierce would return, if their brief encounter had meant as much to him as it apparently had to her. On Thursday afternoon, just as the lunch rush was winding down and Elena was beginning to think about the mountain of reading she needed to tackle for her evening classes, Murphy himself approached her table. The diner's owner was a man of few words and fewer smiles, someone who'd built his business on the principle that efficiency and consistency mattered more than personality or charm. In the 3 years Elena had worked for him, she could count on one hand the number of personal conversations they'd shared. "Need to see you in the office," Murphy said gruffly, his weathered face giving no hint of what this unexpected summons might mean. Elena's stomach dropped as she followed him toward the small cluttered space behind the kitchen that served as Murphy's administrative headquarters. The office was barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, its walls covered with supplier invoices, health department certificates, and faded photographs of the diner's early days when Murphy had been young and optimistic about the restaurant business. "Sit down," Murphy said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair behind his desk. Elena perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, her mind racing through possible explanations for this meeting. Had she made a mistake with an order? Violated some policy she wasn't aware of? Been too slow during the lunch rush on Tuesday when she'd spent so much time with Evan Pierce? "Got a call yesterday," Murphy continued, his expression unreadable. "From some fancy law firm downtown. Seems like you made quite an impression on someone." Elena's confusion must have shown on her face, because Murphy's expression softened slightly, the first time she'd ever seen anything approaching warmth in his weathered features. "Fellow came in here Tuesday, had some kind of episode. You helped him out, apparently made quite an impression. Ring any bells?" "The man in booth 7, Elena said quietly. "Evan Pierce." Murphy nodded slowly. Turns out Mr. Pierce is somebody pretty important, and he's got a job offer for you." The words hit Elena like cold water, shocking in their impossibility. Job offers didn't come to waitresses at Murphy's Diner, especially not from billionaire tech executives. The gulf between her world and Evan Pierce's seemed too vast to bridge with anything as simple as 30 minutes of human kindness. "What kind of job offer?" she asked, though part of her was already convinced this had to be some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. Murphy reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a business card, cream-colored and heavy, with elegant lettering that spoke of expense and attention to detail. "They want you to call this number, set up a meeting, something about a mental health initiative, working directly with Mr. Pierce on some new project." Elena took the card with trembling fingers, reading the embossed text that identified the sender as Pierce Technologies' Human Resources Department. The reality of the situation began to sink in slowly, like water seeping through fabric. This wasn't a dream or a misunderstanding. Evan Pierce, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world, was offering her a job based on their brief encounter in Booth 7. "I don't understand," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized she understood perfectly. Evan had experienced something in those moments of vulnerability that had resonated with him, had seen in Elena's instinctive compassion something valuable enough to build upon. "Neither do I," Murphy admitted, but there was something in his voice that suggested pride rather than confusion. "But I've been running this place for 32 years, and I've never had anybody offer one of my waitresses a six-figure salary to leave." 6 figures. Elena's mind struggled to process the number, to comprehend what that kind of money would mean for her life, her family, her future. She could pay off her student loans, help her mother retire from the factory job that was slowly destroying her back, give Miguel the resources he needed for college without him having to worry about scholarships and financial aid. "He wants me to call today," Elena said, reading from the card. "To set up a meeting for tomorrow." Murphy nodded. "Take the rest of the day off. Hell, take the rest of the week if you need it. This kind of opportunity," he paused, searching for words to describe something outside his experience. "This kind of opportunity doesn't come around twice." Elena walked home in a daze, the business card clutched in her hand like a talisman. The familiar streets of her neighborhood seemed different somehow, as if she were seeing them through new eyes, from the perspective of someone whose life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The small houses and corner stores that had always represented the boundaries of her world suddenly seemed like stepping stones rather than destinations. She called the number from her kitchen table, her hands shaking as she dialed. The woman who answered was professional and warm, explaining that Mr. Pierce would like to meet with Elena the following day at Pierce Technologies headquarters downtown. A car would be sent to pick her up. All she needed to do was be ready at 10 o'clock sharp. That night, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. 2 days ago, she'd been a waitress whose biggest concern was whether her tips would cover next month's rent. Now, she was facing the possibility of working for one of the most successful companies in the world, earning more money than she'd ever dreamed possible, all because she'd shown basic human kindness to a stranger in Prague. Crisis. The car that arrived the next morning was exactly what Elena had expected. Sleek and expensive, with a professional driver who treated her with the kind of deference usually reserved for much more important people. As they drove through downtown traffic toward the gleaming tower that housed Pierce Technologies, Elena found herself thinking about the distance she was traveling, not just in miles but in worlds. Pierce Technologies occupied the top 15 floors of one of the city's most prestigious office buildings, its lobby a testament to the kind of wealth and success that Elena had only seen in movies. The receptionist who greeted her was impeccably dressed and unfailingly polite, treating Elena with the same professional courtesy she would have extended to a major investor or business partner. The elevator ride to the 40th floor gave Elena time to think about what she wanted to say to Evan Pierce, how she could possibly explain her qualifications for a job she didn't fully understand in a world she'd never been part of. But when the doors opened and she was escorted to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, all her prepared speeches evaporated. Evan Pierce looked different in his natural environment, more confident and composed than the panicked man she'd encountered in booth 7. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair styled with the kind of precision that spoke of expensive grooming, his bearing that of someone accustomed to command and control. But when he looked up from the documents he'd been reviewing and met Elena's eyes, she saw the same vulnerability that had first drawn her to help him. "Elena," he said, standing to greet her, his voice carrying the same quiet intensity she remembered. "Thank you for coming." The conference room was a monument to corporate success, its polished table large enough to seat 20 people, its walls decorated with awards and photographs documenting Pierce Technology's rise to prominence. Elena felt small and out of place in her best dress, a simple black outfit she'd bought for job interviews that suddenly seemed inadequate for such surroundings. "Please, sit down," Evan said, gesturing to a chair near the head of the table. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be great," Elena said, grateful for something familiar to anchor her in this unfamiliar environment. Evan pressed a button on the conference table, and within moments, an assistant appeared with a silver tray bearing coffee service that probably cost more than Elena's monthly grocery budget. The ritual of pouring and serving gave her a moment to collect her thoughts, to try to bridge the gap between the Elena who served coffee at Murphy's Diner and the Elena who was apparently being courted by a billionaire tech executive. "I'm sure you're wondering why you're here," Evan said once they were alone again, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup in a gesture that reminded Elena of their first meeting. "The thought had crossed my mind," Elena admitted, surprised by her own ability to maintain some composure in such overwhelming circumstances. Evan smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen since arriving. "What you did for me the other day, it meant more than you could possibly know. I'd been struggling for months with anxiety, panic attacks that come out of nowhere and leave me feeling completely helpless. I've worked with therapists, tried medication, attended support groups, but nothing seemed to help until you sat down in that booth and just—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You just saw me. Not the CEO or the billionaire or the guy whose face is on magazine covers. You saw a person in pain, and you helped." Elena felt a flush of warmth at his words, recognition of something she'd always believed but rarely heard acknowledged. Anyone would have done the same thing. "No," Evan said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Trust me on this. I've been in rooms full of people having panic attacks, and no one ever noticed. No one ever cared enough to stop what they were doing and just sit with me." He stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the city spread below them. From this height, the people and cars looked like toys, the problems and struggles of everyday life reduced to abstract patterns of movement and commerce. "I've been thinking a lot about mental health lately," Evan continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd given considerable thought to what he was about to say. "About how isolated we've become, how the very technology that's supposed to connect us has actually made us more alone than ever. I want to do something about that, something meaningful and lasting." Elena waited, sensing that Evan was building towards something important, something that would explain why she was sitting in this conference room instead of serving lunch at Murphy's Diner. "I'm launching a new initiative," Evan said, turning back to face her. "A comprehensive mental health program that goes beyond traditional therapy and medication. I want to create something that addresses the human connection aspect of healing, the kind of authentic care and compassion that you showed me. And I want you to help me build it." The magnitude of what he was proposing began to sink in slowly. Elena had expected a job offer, but nothing on this scale, nothing that would position her as a partner in reshaping how society approached mental health care. "I don't have any experience in mental health," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she realized they weren't entirely true. Her entire life had been a master class in understanding and responding to human need. From caring for Miguel through his anxiety to supporting her mother through the depression that followed their father's abandonment. "You have something more valuable than experience," Evan said. "You have intuition, empathy, the ability to see past surface appearances to the person underneath. Those aren't skills you can learn in school or acquire through training. They're either part of who you are or they're not." Elena thought about her years at Murphy's Diner, the dozens of customers she'd served who were dealing with their own struggles, their own moments of crisis and desperation. She'd never thought of her natural inclination to help as particularly special or valuable, had always assumed that everyone possessed the same basic capacity for compassion. What exactly would I be doing?" she asked, beginning to allow herself to believe that this impossible opportunity might actually be real. Evan returned to his seat, his expression becoming more animated as he outlined his vision. "We're creating a network of crisis intervention specialists, people who can recognize and respond to mental health emergencies in everyday settings. Coffee shops, restaurants, retail stores, anywhere people gather and interact. The idea is to train individuals like yourself to provide immediate support while connecting people with professional resources." The concept was ambitious and revolutionary, a complete reimagining of how society might address mental health crises. Instead of waiting for people to seek help or recognize their own need for intervention, Evan was proposing to embed support systems in the fabric of daily life, to create a safety net of trained, compassionate individuals who could catch people before they fell too far. The salary would be $120,000 to start, Evan continued, the number hitting Elena like a physical force. Plus benefits, stock options, and complete autonomy to develop your training programs however you see fit. You'd be reporting directly to me, working with a team of the best mental health professionals in the country. Elena stared at him, her mind struggling to process not just the money but the scope of responsibility he was offering. Less than a week ago, she'd been worried about making rent. Now, she was being offered the chance to help create something that could potentially save lives on a massive scale. "Why me?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since Murphy first mentioned the job offer. "You could hire anyone, people with degrees and credentials and years of experience. Why a waitress from a diner?" Evan's expression grew serious, and Elena saw again the vulnerability that had first drawn her to help him. "Because you're the only person who's ever been able to talk me through a panic attack. Because you saw someone in crisis, and your first instinct was to help, not to document it, or analyze it, or turn it into content for social media. Because in a world full of people who talk about compassion, you actually practice it." The weight of his faith in her was both humbling and terrifying. Elena had spent her life being practical, making decisions based on immediate necessity rather than grand ambitions. The idea of stepping into a role with such significant impact and responsibility felt like being asked to leap across a chasm with no guarantee of landing safely on the other side. "I need time to think about this," Elena said, though part of her already knew what her answer would be. "Of course," Evan said. "Take all the time you need. But I hope you'll consider it seriously. What you have, what you showed me in that diner, it's exactly what the world needs more of right now." As Eleanor rode the elevator back down to street level, she thought about the conversation she'd just had, the opportunity that lay before her like an open door to a completely different life. The practical part of her mind was already calculating what the salary would mean, how it would change not just her future, but her family's future. But beyond the money was something even more valuable. The chance to take her natural inclination to help people and scale it up to a level where it could make a real difference in the world. The driver was waiting to take her home, but Elena asked him to drop her off at Murphy's Diner instead. She needed to ground herself in the familiar, to process what had just happened in the environment where it had all begun. The lunch rush was in full swing when she walked through the door, Ruby moving efficiently between tables, while Murphy worked the grill with his usual focused intensity. Elena slid into booth 7, the same seat where she'd first encountered Evan Pierce, and tried to imagine herself in the role he'd described, training others to recognize and respond to mental health crises, developing programs that could be implemented across the country, working with experts and researchers to create something entirely new. It felt impossibly ambitious and simultaneously exactly right, as if every experience in her life had been preparing her for this moment. Ruby appeared at her table with a coffee pot and a curious expression. "Heard you had some fancy meeting downtown. How'd it go?" "He offered me a job," Elena said, the words still sounding unreal even as she spoke them. "The guy from Tuesday?" The one you spent half an hour babysitting instead of working your section? Ruby's tone was skeptical, but Elena could see the curiosity behind her dismissive words. He's offering me more money than I ever imagined making, to do work that actually matters, that could help people. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, seeking comfort in its familiar warmth. Ruby studied her for a long moment, her expression softening in a way Elena had rarely seen. You gonna take it? I think I have to, Elena said, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke. I mean, how do you turn down the chance to maybe make a real difference? You don't, Ruby said simply. You take the leap and hope for the best. That's all any of us can do. Elena spent the rest of the afternoon in booth 7, watching the familiar rhythms of the diner while her mind wandered through possibilities and plans. She thought about Miguel, who could now attend any college he wanted without worrying about the cost. She thought about her mother, who could finally retire from the factory job that was slowly destroying her body. She thought about all the people she might be able to help if Evan's vision became reality. All the crisis moments where a trained, compassionate response could make the difference between despair and hope. When she finally called Evan that evening, her voice was steady with certainty. I'll take the job. I was hoping you'd say that, Evan replied, and Elena could hear the smile in his voice. When can you start? How about Monday? Elena said, looking around her small apartment that suddenly felt less like a permanent address and more like a launching pad for something entirely new. Monday it is. Welcome to Pierce Technologies, Elena. I have a feeling you're going to change everything. As Elena hung up the phone, she realized that Evan Pierce was probably right. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But more importantly, she was going to have the chance to change other people's lives as well. The waitress who had instinctively reached out to help a stranger in crisis was about to become something she'd never dreamed possible. A professional advocate for human compassion in a world that desperately needed more of it. The next Monday morning, Elena Rodriguez walked into Pierce Technologies, not as a visitor, but as an employee, ready to begin the work of transforming her natural gifts into something that could heal a broken world, one person at a time. The girl from the diner was about to become something much more, and it had all started with a simple decision to sit down with someone who needed help and refused to look away from their pain. 6 months later, Elena's program had trained over 300 crisis intervention specialists across 12 states, preventing countless tragedies and connecting thousands of people with the help they needed. The waitress who had seen a stranger's panic attack and chosen compassion over efficiency had indeed changed everything, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is simply one person willing to care about another's pain. And in booth 7 at Murphy's Diner, where it all began, a small plaque now read, in recognition of Elena Rodriguez, who proved that kindness changes the world. It was a reminder that extraordinary things often begin with the most ordinary acts of human decency, and that sometimes the person who needs saving the most is the one with everything to lose. Elena's first day at Pierce Technologies had been overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. The gleaming offices, the advanced technology, the brilliant minds working on projects that would shape the future, all of it represented a world so far removed from her experience that she'd felt like an imposter, wearing borrowed clothes. But Evan had been there to guide her through the initial awkwardness, introducing her to key team members with a pride that made it clear he considered her recruitment a significant victory. Dr. Sarah Chen, the head of Pierce Technologies' new mental health initiative, had been Elena's first real test. A Harvard-trained psychiatrist with 20 years of clinical experience, Dr. Chen had initially been skeptical of Evan's decision to hire someone with no formal credentials in mental health. Elena could see the doubt in the older woman's eyes during their first meeting, the polite but unmistakable question of what a diner waitress could possibly contribute to such serious work. Mr. Pierce has told me about your encounter, Dr. Chen had said during their initial interview, her tone carefully neutral. While I appreciate the human element of what you did, I'm curious about how you see yourself fitting into a clinical framework. Elena had taken a deep breath, drawing on the same calm she'd found in booth 7 when Evan was drowning in panic. I don't think I fit into a clinical framework, she'd said honestly. I think maybe that's the point. The people who need help most are the ones who never make it to a clinic, who are struggling in grocery stores and coffee shops and diners. They need someone who can meet them where they are, not where the system thinks they should be." End quote. Dr. Chen's expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition that perhaps there was more to Elena's approach than simple good intentions. Over the following weeks, as they worked together to develop training protocols, that initial skepticism had transformed into genuine respect. Elena's insights into human behavior, shaped by years of reading people's needs across diner tables, proved invaluable in creating programs that could work in real-world settings. The training program they developed together was unlike anything that existed in traditional mental health education. Instead of focusing primarily on diagnosis and treatment protocols, Elena pushed for an approach that emphasized recognition and immediate support. She drew on her own experiences, creating scenarios based on actual encounters she'd had with customers over the years, teaching trainees to see beyond surface presentations to the underlying struggles people carried with them. Mental health crisis doesn't announce itself with a diagnosis, Elena would tell each new group of trainees, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned these lessons through lived experience rather than textbook study. It shows up as the businessman who can't stop his hands from shaking, the mother who tears up when you ask if she wants cream in her coffee, the teenager who sits alone in the corner booth for 3 hours nursing a single soda. Your job isn't to fix them. Your job is to see them and let them know they're not alone. The program's first major test came 3 months after Elena started, when a participant named Marcus intervened in what could have been a tragedy at a downtown coffee shop. A young woman had been sitting alone for hours, staring at her phone with increasing agitation, her breathing becoming more labored as the afternoon wore on. Marcus, a barista who'd completed Elena's training the previous month, recognized the signs Elena had taught him to watch for. Instead of ignoring the situation or calling security, Marcus had approached the woman with the same gentle directness Elena had used with Evan. He'd offered her a glass of water, asked if she was okay, and when she broke down crying, he'd sat with her until the crisis passed. Later investigation revealed that the woman had been moments away from taking her own life, driven to desperation by a combination of job loss and relationship breakdown that had left her feeling completely isolated. The story made national news, not because of the dramatic nature of the intervention, but because of what it represented. Here was proof that Elena's vision could work, that ordinary people in ordinary settings could be trained to recognize and respond to mental health emergencies with the same skill and compassion that had once saved Evan Pierce in a small-town diner. Evan had called Elena into his office the day the story broke, his face bearing the same expression of gratitude she remembered from their first meeting. "Do you realize what you've done?" he'd asked, gesturing to the newspaper coverage spread across his desk. "This is just the beginning. Imagine what happens when we have people like Marcus in every coffee shop, every restaurant, every place where people gather." Elena had looked at the articles, at the photograph of Marcus receiving recognition from the mayor, at the quotes from mental health professionals praising the innovative approach to crisis intervention. But what struck her most was a comment from the woman who'd been saved, describing how it felt to have someone simply notice her pain and choose to respond with kindness rather than judgment. "It's not about me," Elena had said, though she felt a deep sense of satisfaction at seeing her vision validated. "It's about changing how we see each other, how we respond to suffering. Everyone deserves to have someone notice when they're struggling." The success of Marcus's intervention led to increased funding and expansion of the program. Pierce Technologies partnered with major restaurant chains, retail corporations, and service industries to implement Elena's training protocols on a massive scale. Within 6 months, over 1,000 businesses across the country had at least one employee trained in Elena's approach to crisis recognition and response. But the program's growth also brought new challenges. Elena found herself traveling constantly, conducting training sessions in cities she'd never imagined visiting, working with people from backgrounds as diverse as the customers she'd once served at Murphy's Diner. Each location brought its own unique circumstances and cultural considerations, requiring Elena to adapt her approach while maintaining the core principles that made it effective. In Chicago, she worked with hotel staff to recognize signs of human trafficking among guests. In Seattle, She trained coffee shop employees to identify and support homeless individuals struggling with untreated mental illness. In Atlanta, she developed specialized protocols for recognizing domestic violence situations in restaurant settings. Each new application of her methodology reinforced Elena's belief that compassion was a universal language, but one that needed to be spoken with cultural sensitivity and local understanding. The personal cost of this success was something Elena hadn't anticipated. The constant travel, the pressure of public speaking, the weight of knowing that lives depended on the effectiveness of her training, all of it created a stress she'd never experienced during her simpler life at Murphy's Diner. There were nights when she lay awake in anonymous hotel rooms, wondering if she was truly qualified for the responsibility she'd accepted, if her success was sustainable or just a fortunate accident. It was during one of these difficult periods that Evan surprised her by showing up at a training session in Denver, sitting quietly in the back of the room as Elena worked with a group of airport employees. She didn't notice him until after the session ended, when she found him waiting by the registration table, with the same vulnerable expression she remembered from their first meeting. "How are you holding up?" he asked, and the genuine concern in his voice reminded Elena why she'd trusted him enough to take this leap in the first place. "Some days are harder than others," Elena admitted, grateful for the opportunity to be honest about her struggles with someone who would understand. "I keep thinking about all the people I might not reach, all the situations where the training won't be enough." Evan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I felt the same way when Pierce Technology started growing beyond what I could personally manage. The fear that success brings its own kind of responsibility, that every decision affects more lives than you can count." They walked through downtown Denver together, two people who'd found themselves thrust into roles larger than anything they'd originally imagined. Elena told Evan about the hotel clerk in Phoenix, who'd prevented a suicide, about the department store manager in Memphis, who'd connected a veteran with PTSD to appropriate resources, about the dozens of success stories that validated their approach, but also increased the pressure to expand even further. "You know what I've learned?" Evan said, as they stopped at a coffee shop that reminded Elena painfully of the countless similar establishments where she'd conducted training sessions. "The most important thing isn't reaching everyone. It's creating something that can grow beyond us, that can survive and evolve even after we're not directly involved." Elena understood what he meant, but the practical implications were daunting. She'd built the program around her own intuitive understanding of human nature, her ability to read situations and respond appropriately. The idea of codifying that intuition into something others could replicate and improve upon felt like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. "I've been thinking about that," Elena said. "About how to make this bigger than just my approach, how to create something that can adapt to different situations and communities. What if we brought in more people like you?" Evan suggested. "Not necessarily with your exact background, but with that same natural ability to connect with others, to see past surface appearances to real need." The idea sparked something in Elena's mind, a vision of what the program could become if it expanded beyond her individual efforts. Instead of trying to teach everyone to think like her, they could identify individuals in each community who already possessed similar instincts and give them the tools and support to develop their natural abilities. Over the following months, Elena and her team developed a new approach to recruitment and training. Instead of focusing solely on professional credentials, they looked for individuals who demonstrated natural empathy and situational awareness. They found candidates in unexpected places: a security guard who always seemed to know when customers needed help, a bus driver who regularly checked on passengers who seemed distressed, a grocery store cashier who had an uncanny ability to recognize when someone was struggling financially. These new trainers brought their own insights and experiences to the program, adapting Elena's core principles to their specific environments and communities. A former gang member turned youth counselor developed protocols for recognizing and intervening in situations involving at-risk teenagers. A retired nurse created training modules focused on identifying mental health crises among elderly customers. A military veteran designed approaches specifically for recognizing and supporting other veterans struggling with PTSD and adjustment disorders. The program's evolution beyond Elena's direct control was both exciting and terrifying. She found herself in the role of mentor and supervisor rather than primary trainer, watching as others took her ideas and improved upon them in ways she never could have imagined. It was gratifying to see the program grow beyond her individual capabilities, but it also required her to let go of the direct control that had made her feel secure in the early days. 1 year after starting at Pierce Technologies, Elena stood before an audience of 500 mental health professionals at a national conference, delivering a keynote address about community-based crisis intervention. The girl who had once been intimidated by speaking to a table of customers was now addressing experts from around the world, sharing insights that were reshaping how society approached mental health support. Traditional mental health care assumes that people in crisis will seek help, Elena told the audience, her voice carrying the confidence she'd developed through months of public speaking. But my experience suggests that most people in crisis are hoping someone will notice their struggle and offer support before they have to ask for it. We've created a system that waits for people to fall, when what we really need is a system that catches them before they hit the ground." End quote. The standing ovation she received was gratifying, but what meant more to Elena were the conversations that followed. Mental health professionals from around the world approached her with stories of how her approach had influenced their work, how the principles she'd developed were being adapted to different cultural contexts and healthcare systems. Dr. Chen, who had become not just a colleague but a true friend, found Elena after the presentation. "You know what's remarkable about what you've accomplished?" she said. "You've managed to professionalize compassion without bureaucratizing it. That's something most of us in the field struggle with our entire careers." Elena appreciated the recognition, but her mind was already moving toward the next challenge. The program's success had attracted attention from government agencies and international organizations interested in implementing similar approaches on an even larger scale. The possibility of taking her small-town insights global was both thrilling and overwhelming. That evening, Elena called her mother from her hotel room, needing to ground herself in the familiar before facing whatever came next. Her mother's voice, warm and proud, reminded Elena of where she'd come from and why the work mattered. "Mija, I saw you on the news today," her mother said. "I kept thinking about when you were little, how you always brought home stray cats and tried to feed every hungry kid in the neighborhood. I guess some things never change. Some things just get bigger," Eleanor replied, looking out at the city lights below her hotel window. "Are you happy?" her mother asked, the question that mattered more than any professional recognition or financial success. Elena considered the question seriously. The past year had been the most challenging and rewarding of her life, filled with opportunities she'd never imagined, and responsibilities that sometimes felt overwhelming. She'd helped create something that was genuinely making a difference in people's lives, had seen her ideas implemented in ways that were preventing tragedies and connecting people with help when they needed it most. "I'm tired," Elena admitted, "and sometimes scared that I'm not smart enough or experienced enough for what I'm doing. But yes, I'm happy. I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do." "Then you're exactly where you need to be," her mother said with the simple wisdom that had guided Elena throughout her childhood. After ending the call, Elena sat in her hotel room, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she'd been a waitress whose biggest concern was making enough tips to cover rent. Now she was the architect of a program that was changing how society responded to mental health crises, working with some of the most brilliant minds in the field to create something entirely new. But at its core, what she was doing wasn't really that different from what she'd always done. She was still noticing when people were struggling, still offering support in whatever way she could, still believing that human connection was the most powerful force for healing in the world. The scale had changed. The resources were vastly greater, but the fundamental motivation remained the same. The next morning brought news that would test everything Elena had built. A situation in Portland had gone wrong, despite the presence of a trained crisis intervention specialist. A man experiencing a psychotic episode had become violent when approached, resulting in injuries to both the specialist and bystanders. Critics were already questioning whether Elena's approach put undertrained civilians in dangerous situations they weren't equipped to handle. Elena flew to Portland immediately, spending hours with the injured specialist and reviewing what had happened. The specialist, a restaurant manager named David, had followed protocols correctly, but had encountered a situation beyond what any training could have prepared him for. The man in crisis had been experiencing delusions that made him perceive any approach as threatening, and David's well-intentioned intervention had inadvertently escalated the situation. "I keep thinking I should have known," David said from his hospital bed, his arm in a cast from the encounter. "All that training, and I couldn't tell the difference between someone having a panic attack and someone who might hurt people." Elena sat beside his bed, reminded of her own early doubts about whether she was qualified for the work she'd taken on. "You couldn't have known," she said firmly. "No training can prepare someone for every possible situation. What matters is that you cared enough to try, and that most of the time, caring is exactly what someone needs." But Elena knew that David's experience would have implications far beyond his individual case. The media coverage was already questioning the wisdom of putting untrained civilians in potentially dangerous situations, and Elena could see her program's expansion being threatened by concerns about liability and safety. The crisis forced Elena to confront limitations in her approach that she'd been reluctant to acknowledge. While her training was highly effective for the vast majority of mental health situations, there were always going to be cases that required professional intervention, situations where well-meaning civilians could inadvertently make things worse. Working with Dr. Chen and a team of crisis intervention specialists, Elena developed new protocols that emphasized recognition and appropriate referral rather than direct intervention in potentially dangerous situations. The revised training included extensive modules on identifying when to step back and call for professional help, creating clearer boundaries around what civilian crisis intervention specialists should and shouldn't attempt. "It's not a failure of the program," Dr. Chen assured Elena as they worked through the revisions. "It's evolution. Every effective system has to adapt when it encounters situations it wasn't designed to handle." The Portland incident ultimately made Elena's program stronger, but it also reinforced the weight of responsibility she carried. Every person she trained, every protocol she developed, every expansion of the program into new settings carried the potential for both tremendous good and unintended consequences. The success stories that had once given her confidence now came with the sobering awareness that failure was always possible. 6 months later, Elena found herself back at Murphy's Diner, sitting in booth 7 where everything had started. She'd returned to her hometown for her brother Miguel's college graduation, the first person in their family to earn a degree, made possible by the financial stability Elena's new career had brought to their household. Murphy himself had aged noticeably in the 2 years since Elena left, his movements slower, but his gruff demeanor unchanged. He slid into the booth across from her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the same skeptical expression he'd worn when she first told him about Evan Pierce's job offer. "So how's the big-time mental health expert business?" Murphy asked, but there was affection in his voice beneath the sarcasm. "Complicated," Elena admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm changing the world. Other days, I wonder if I'm just making things more complicated than they need to be." Murphy nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee with the same methodical movements Eleanor remembered from her waitressing days. "You know what I told Ruby when she asked me about that fancy job of yours?" Elena shook her head. "I told her that anyone who could handle the lunch rush at this place and still care about whether some stranger was having a bad day, that person was qualified for just about anything." Murphy's weathered face softened slightly. "What you did here? What you're doing now? It's the same thing. You see people who need help and you help them. Everything else is just details." Elena looked around the familiar interior of Murphy's Diner, at the cracked vinyl booths and scarred formica tables that had witnessed countless small dramas and everyday struggles. The setting was humble, but the human experiences that played out here were no less significant than those she encountered in corporate boardrooms and conference centers. "I've been thinking about coming back," Elena said, surprising herself with the admission. "Not permanently, but regularly. Training sessions here, using the diner as a real-world laboratory for crisis intervention in everyday settings." Murphy's eyebrows rose. "You want to turn my restaurant into some kind of mental health clinic?" "Not a clinic," Elena clarified. A demonstration site. Show people that crisis intervention doesn't require special equipment or clinical settings. Show them that it can happen anywhere people care enough to pay attention. The idea had been forming in Elena's mind for months, a way to return her program to its roots while also expanding its reach. Murphy's Diner represented the kind of authentic community space where her approach worked best, where the absence of pretense and hierarchy allowed genuine human connection to flourish. Murphy considered the proposal, his expression thoughtful. Would it bring in customers? Elena laughed, recognizing the practical businessman beneath Murphy's gruff exterior. It would bring in reporters, trainers, mental health professionals, probably some curiosity seekers. Whether they'd order the meatloaf is up to you. 3 months later, Murphy's Diner hosted its first official crisis intervention training workshop, with Elena leading 40 participants through practical exercises in recognizing and responding to mental bias. Health emergencies in restaurant settings. The workshop was fully booked, with a waiting list that stretched into the following year. Evan Pierce attended the first session, sitting quietly in the back of the diner while Elena demonstrated techniques using actual customers as examples, with their permission. Watching him in the environment where they'd first met, Elena was struck by how much both of their lives had changed since that initial encounter. After the workshop, Evan lingered while Elena cleaned up, helping her stack chairs and collect training materials with the unselfconscious helpfulness she remembered from their early meetings. "This feels right," he said, gesturing around the diner. "Bringing it back to where it started." Elena nodded, feeling a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since leaving Murphy's 2 years earlier. "I think I needed to remember that the goal isn't to create something completely new. It's to recognize and nurture what already exists in places like this." "What's next?" Evan asked, the question that had driven both of their careers since that first meeting. Elena looked around the diner, at the booth where a stranger's panic attack had launched her into a career she never could have imagined. At the familiar faces of staff and customers who represented the community that had shaped her understanding of human nature. "I think next is making sure this can happen everywhere," Elena said. "Not just in programs we design or trainings we conduct, but in every place where people gather. Making compassion as common as coffee, as automatic as asking if someone wants cream and sugar." It was an ambitious goal, perhaps impossible to achieve completely. But Elena had learned that impossibility was often just a starting point for someone determined enough to try. The waitress who had once worried about making rent was now working to transform how an entire society responded to human suffering. One conversation, one crisis, one act of compassion at a time. As she walked home through the familiar streets of her childhood neighborhood, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd achieved financial security beyond her wildest dreams, had gained recognition and respect in a field she'd never intended to enter, had seen her ideas implemented on a scale that was genuinely changing lives. But what mattered most was that she'd remained true to the instinct that had first led her to sit down with a panicking stranger in booth 7. At its core, her work was still about seeing people who were struggling and choosing to respond with kindness rather than indifference. Everything else, the programs and protocols and professional recognition, was just a way of scaling up that fundamental human impulse. 2 years later, Elena's program had trained over 10,000 crisis intervention specialists across 48 states and 6 countries. The model had been adapted for schools, workplaces, transportation hubs, and community centers, creating a global network of individuals equipped to recognize and respond to mental health emergencies in, quote, everyday settings. The statistics were impressive. Thousands of lives saved, countless more connected with appropriate professional help, measurable reductions in suicide rates in communities where the program had been implemented. But for Elena, the most meaningful measure of success remained the individual stories, the moments when human connection made the difference between despair and hope. She still traveled constantly, still spoke at conferences and trained new specialists, still worked with researchers and policymakers to expand and improve the program. But she also returned regularly to Murphy's Diner, to booth 7 where it all began, where she could remember that extraordinary change often starts with the most ordinary acts of human decency. The plaque commemorating her work had been joined by others, recognizing the dozens of crisis intervention specialists who had trained at Murphy's and gone on to save lives in their own communities. The diner had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for mental health professionals, a reminder that healing could happen anywhere people cared enough to notice each other's pain. Elena Rodriguez had learned that changing the world wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It was about seeing someone in crisis and choosing to sit with them until the storm passed, about believing that every person's suffering mattered enough to warrant attention and care. She'd taken that simple truth and built it into something that was reshaping how society understood and responded to mental health, proving that sometimes the most powerful force for change is simply one person willing to extend compassion to another. The Waitress had become a visionary, the small act of kindness had become a global movement, and the man who'd once sat trembling in booth 7 had become a partner in creating a more compassionate world. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that extraordinary things often begin with the decision to simply care about the person sitting across from you, and that sometimes the most important qualification for changing the world is the willingness to try.